Welcome to the African Alliance podcast, the Brilliant series, brought to you by the Brilliant Consortium's Community Engagement and Advocacy Workstream. This series introduces you to the scientists, researchers, and community activists driving innovation and social progress across our partner sites. In each episode, we'll hear from those in the front lines, whether they're uncovering groundbreaking scientific discoveries or working to empower communities through grassroots activism. These conversations give you an inside look at how collaboration between science and community is transforming lives, challenging systems, and creating solutions that can change the world. In this episode, I'll be speaking to the Brilliant Consortium's community co-lead, an award-winning Zimbabwean activist, Martha Tholanah. Comrade Martha Tholanah, activist, co-lead of the Brilliant Consortium Community Engagement and Advocacy Workstream. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this brilliant podcast series. So wonderful to have an opportunity to chat with you and speak through some of the work that you and Brilliant are doing over the next 5 years. So Comrade Martha, a lot of us activists are commonly referred to as troublemakers. And if you go onto the internet, there are pages and pages and pages about you and your work and your accolades and your career and your history. But tell us a little bit about Martha. What were you like as a child? Were you a troublemaker when you were a child as well? Or is this something you only came into in your later years? Tell us about Martha the child.
I was very quiet. I had very low self-esteem, but my escape was books. I was reading a lot of books because I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to make trouble because I was reading a lot. And also very interested in learning. I think I was doing very well in school. I had very low self-esteem because people always made fun of my big tummy, my big head, from the time I was, before I even started school. And so it made me become very sensitive to when people make fun of others. I really don't like it. And because I feel for the person. So in that sense, I've always had care for people, more sensitivity towards people who are considered underdogs in society. And probably that was what laid the foundation for me becoming an activist, doing the work that I do, that I've done for years. There was another moment when I think I was 17, when the Zimbabwe government decided, it was just 2 or 3 years after independence, the Zimbabwe government decided that women and girls should always be accompanied. They had to be accompanied by a male person, which means they rounded up every woman they found walking on the street. It didn't matter what time of day, who was not accompanied. Every woman and girl was arrested, particularly in the major urban centers. And I had a cousin who was a best friend as well. She was looking up her mother's shop, and she was the same age as me. She was arrested. And for me, the trauma of going to get her from the police cells, and to me, the anger of saying, because we didn't want her to spend a night in the police cells, then we had to pay a fine, which meant she's admitting to guilt, to say she's guilty of loitering. Because when they say if you are accompanied by a man, then you are loitering for prostitution. And I think that was the moment that really fired me up.
If you look back and if you look forward as well, throughout your work, your life, your career, you've taken on some pretty big challenges, legal systems, entrenched systems of oppression, etc. Are there moments of victory that are big or small that stand out to you?
For me, one of the biggest victories was the repeal of the HIV criminalization law. It was a bit frightening because when I challenged and said it's a bad law and it made a headline, in the main newspapers. It was a bit scary, but then it was like, you are not a legal person and you are challenging legal professionals who put this in. But for me, having to boldly make that statement was because when the law was being discussed by women and the women organizations, and they were, advocating for that law to be in place, I remember going into this space where it was being discussed. And then for me, I remember asking the question in the discussion and saying, I am HIV positive, but people will only know that I'm HIV positive if I tell them. So if I happen to meet someone and we agree to have a relationship, is there any way where we can get an affidavit for me to say I disclosed my status to this to this person before we went to bed together? And I don't think they took it like seriously, I think, because they were all focused on getting that law in place. But also in terms of some of the arguments that we were making with the system around repealing that law, Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights also gave a lot of information, facts that we could use when we were doing the advocacy. They gave us training as well around the legal systems and how we could negotiate around that. So in the end, it was repealed. And for me, that was a victory. And a second victory that I'd like to talk about is, for me, working with the LGBTQI community in Zimbabwe. When I started, it was a very lonely place because we were ostracized. I mean, going into spaces and introducing myself, saying that I'm from the Gays and Lesbians of Zimbabwe, which was the name then, you were then treated like a leper. I don't know where I got the strength to remain in this space, because when I look back, I'm thinking, how did I, continue and go back time after time, but also spend the whole day in there, even when, if there are discussions, you raise your hand and no one wants to hear, your opinion. But in the end, something started to give, and we started to have discussions. At some point, something shifted. I think it shifted because we were doing publications, particularly in the health department, where we kept, we did lots of publications. And when we did those publications, we would always make a package for the Ministry of Health. And I made it a point that when I made the package for Ministry of Health, it was two packages, one for the office and one which I said to the minister, this is for you. I delivered the one for the office, but this is for you as the minister. From there, it began to show a shift. I think for me, it was like, oh, at last something is happening. Even getting invitations from Ministry of Health, which are coming to officially inviting girls to events, to discussions. So for me, that was a big victory. And now, when I just look at the development now to see where we are, to me, that's a big victory, because I consider that the foundation was very hard to make. It was a very difficult process, but a lot of times I'm happy that I remained, I continued with that and didn't give up.
Throughout everything you've said, there's also been a predominant narrative or a feature, and that's women and girls, and of course the LGBTQI community. You are also a highly respected figure in the feminist movement and have been, a mentor and ally and a leader for many, many years in the feminist movement. What drew you to feminism, and what does it mean? What does it mean to you?
To me, feminism is about equal opportunities and rejecting oppression of anyone by anyone. And I was drawn to feminism, particularly by that incident where my cousin was arrested, because it was women and girls who were targeted. I think the anger that I had then was around, I think to take you back, was around during the Chimurenga War, the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. I was very young, but we were taken as, you know, the runners, the messengers for the guerrilla fighters. You know, sending messages in different villages. We didn't have phones. We were in the rural areas, but also the fact that we saw that the freedom fighters were men and women who were carrying guns. We, you know, we would know that they've been in combat with the Rhodesian forces. So during that war, I never saw any difference in saying women will not go to the front because they are women. Everyone went to the war front if they were trained as, you know, as freedom fighters. They were also traumatic events for us. I think even girls who were my age, quite a number of them went through that. You know, in my mind, when I was, I think just before 12 years, I was just under 12 years old. And I remember that I was, you know, I was sexually violated. And then you feel powerless because this is someone, how do you resist someone with a gun? At that time, I didn't know very much what was happening. What's the meaning of this? Because no one ever talked about sex. No one ever talked about what do you do if someone tries to touch you inappropriately. And, you know, so I think a lot of those experiences for me, and the fact that I couldn't talk about those experiences drove me to feminism.
Thanks for that. I think it's another powerful reminder of the injustices that many folks who are now activists and leaders in the space for justice went through, that really molded and shaped our politics and our realities and our work today. Thank you. You know, part of the reason why we're having this discussion is to bring communities information and insights into this consortium that we call Brilliant, that is looking at discovery medicine, you know, in Africa, by Africans, for Africans. What is your role in this consortium called Brilliant?
My role is in the community engagement and advocacy, and that will be ensuring that there is a vibrant community engagement, vibrant advocacy to make sure that communities, CSOs, and just ordinary people, I think of where people gather, like, you know, where youth are having their gatherings, or where, you know, church people are having their gatherings, to say, I think this is information that people need to be aware of. The Brilliant is a good opportunity for people to get an understanding of how research happens. And this is through our engagement to say, this is discovery, and they are learning about it early, and they can engage with it and ask questions and get their questions answered, so that they get a good understanding of the research process, and then more so of the HIV vaccine development process. I also noted that a lot of the community advisory board members are not aware, or they find it very complex to understand the HIV vaccine process. And this is something we want to try and make it something that is palatable, digestible for communities, for the community advisory board members, since they go out there to be with the community. And I think part of that also, when I talked of communities, we include the media, to say, because they are very powerful in terms of getting accurate information out there. So I think the media is one of the critical community that we need to work with, particularly African journalists, since they are also reporting on the on this Brilliant, which is by Africans for Africans.
This is the Brilliant series of podcasts brought to you by the Consortium's Community Engagement and Advocacy Workstream, introducing you to the scientists, researchers, and community activists at the center of HIV vaccine discovery. Today, I'm speaking to the Brilliant Consortium's Community Engagement and Advocacy co-lead and award-winning Zimbabwean activist, Martha Tholanah. You know, Com, you've been around for a while in this space, and you play many roles, you wear many hats. How, if at all, has community engagement evolved over the years to where it is now? And what do you think we've gotten right and what do you think we've gotten wrong?
Community engagement is involved in terms of when I first got into this space, it was like the research was there in its own space, and people who were advocates, the civil society organizations who were working on HIV, whether prevention, whether treatment, whether it was support for people with HIV. They were not really linking the work they are doing with the scientific development that was happening in the research institutes. So what I'm seeing now is that there's more demand. The demand is growing for people to get to understand about research. They are keen to understand about research.
No, absolutely. You know, big conference on really focusing on HIV prevention, HIV R4P, has just come to an end in Lima, Peru. And of course, we saw headlines about this new, almost wonder drug, lenacapavir, 2 injections, stopping 100% of new infection. And of course, Big Pharma have reminded us who they are, and they've shown us that the communities, that the countries that took part in the trial in Latin America are now sitting with no access, despite the headlines, despite the positivity, despite the celebrations. We're reminded yet again that no matter how amazing the science is, no matter how thoughtful the principal investigator and their team are, at the end of the day, with Big Pharma partnering in this type of research, you can almost be assured that the road is not going to be easy to access. And of course, we've been calling years and years now for a different level of consciousness amongst scientists and researchers before they begin trials to secure access beyond the trial. And we've not really seen that happening as much as we want it to happen. Of course, Depiverin ring, still many, many, many women waiting for access. So many of these fruits of research come about and remain out of the reach of those who need them, and perhaps more pointedly, those who made them possible. Communities who put their bodies on the line, who gave their time to make these products a reality, continue to be sidelined and left out. In that context, why should communities continue to participate in trials? Why should communities continue to trust the process? When just in COVID, we were reminded that you can't trust the process because the very vaccines you make possible will be out of your reach. And at the end of the day, it comes down to pharma profiteering and where they can get the highest return on investment. What is your message to communities who say, we will not participate in another trial ever again? Research, scientific research, is purely extractive, it's exploitative, it's taking advantage of us, because at the end of the day, we are left high and dry without access to products that we made possible. What is your message to communities?
Yeah, my message to community would be around, first and foremost, that we need the science, we need the research, because for our health and so forth, we need it. It's also why we need to understand the process right from the beginning, especially that part where the big pharma role in that, and also the fact that we need to get more information out there to make the issue of scientific research topical wherever, if we are sitting on a commuter only bus and so forth, and people can discuss about that, because right now it's impossible. You won't hear people discussing that like as a general talk in a in a bus, or yeah, or if people are sitting in a pub, it's not one of those topics that would arise. And for me, this is where I would say the community, if they're saying we need the research, but we need to demand the information, for making the demands, for making the advocacy case to say, this is, yes, we understand this and that and that. This is what we need. We also need this research, but we need guarantees. These are our non-negotiables for us to be able to allow that research to happen, and for any of the community members to volunteer as participants of that study. I think our governments as well are too silent, particularly in our region, that investment in research is almost non-existent. They say, oh, we've contributed because they use infrastructure that our infrastructure, but I don't think a building is enough. I think they need to show more political will than they are, because just saying the researchers are using all buildings, I think it's an insult to the citizens of any country, and it should that that should be rejected. To say you can't use that as an excuse to not put in funding into research.
No, thank you for that. I think that also answered my following question around the next frontier and what we should be looking for in terms of advocacy going forward. So Kom, I think, what you've shared is really characterizes the future. And in many ways, it's tragic that we are still here, where we've not reached that critical mass of communities who are, inflamed with passion around clinical research, but also us having to do that hard work, like you said, with governments and our research
Yeah.
institutes of building confidence, building confidence in the scientific endeavor. So in many ways, we have our work cut out for us. And for those who are listening to this podcast, you can find out more about the work of the Brilliant Consortium in our newsletter called Kipaji, which is on africanalliance.org.za. It will unpack many, many of these issues that we speak about in this podcast series.
I also think that we, as the academic institutions that are conducting research, and also, partnering with communities through the CAB, they really need to look at conflict management. I say this because I always think it's a barrier to effective community engagement, because the community engagement is not stopping with just with the CAB. Community engagement should not stop by saying, we have a study, can you go and tell communities to come and for screening. I think it is beyond that. I think it is it is also for people to understand the research process in general, to be aware in general of the studies. For example, as a CAB member with the UZ-CTRC, I should have a general idea of the studies that are being carried out at any particular time, and also the stages they are. And it may be a lot to ask, but it keeps one, alert, and also it keeps one not to be ambushed with a question on research when they say, oh, because I was doing that, because some will say, because as a CAB member, it's a voluntary it's a voluntary position, and I have my other work. For me, I'm taking wherever I work, even when when I do the work with different entities that I happen to do some work, for, they'll always know that I'm engaged in research. And when there's a particular study, I just take time, like if we are having a meeting, and I just take time to give people a brief. Oh, there's an interesting thing happening. And to me, I think that improves awareness. I wouldn't say because I've gone into a church meeting that I can't mention about clinical research or a particular study that I think people should know about. I think it's about finding opportunities, and this is what I want to go beyond. Finding the opportunities to talk about research should happen with CAB members, but also it should be something that is happening beyond the CAB members. We need to be, to be able to give people enough information, and we'll find people who are interested out there and will lap it up and want to, run with that information and make sure that communities are well informed. Yeah, so we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Thank
No,
you.
absolutely. A lot of work to do,
Yeah.
and it's going to be an interesting 4 years ahead. Martha Tholanah, award-winning activist, feminist icon, and co-lead of the brilliant consortium Community Engagement and Advocacy Workstream. Thank you so much for spending time with us today on this podcast, and we look forward to seeing what the next 4 years of the brilliant consortium bring, both for science, but of course, for communities. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. You've been listening to the African Alliance podcast, the Brilliant Series, bringing you these incredible stories of passion, innovation, and change that take us a step closer to an HIV vaccine. We're constantly inspired by the work being done by our guests, and I hope you are too. The work doesn't stop here. There's always more to learn, more to do, and more to connect with. Stay curious, stay engaged, and we'll be back soon with another inspiring episode, from pioneering scientific research to impactful community activism. The individuals we feature on this show are not just changing their fields, they're shaping the future. To learn more about the Brilliant Consortium and how you can get involved, visit africanalliance.org.za and follow us on social media. If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the podcast so more people can hear these powerful stories.